Alright, so I've been looking for the opportunity to make a series of videos that talk about prose, but I haven't really been able to think of a context in which I could do it in a way that seems interesting, right? I kept thinking about like making up quotes and discussing how I would write it differently or write things this way, write things that way. However, a new idea came to me that allows me to talk about prose, but I think it's a much better approach. So this is what I hope to do in this video and subsequent videos. The general idea is this. As I read books, sometimes I notice that certain lines or certain descriptions of things are pretty lacking, let's say. So I decided I wanted to create a series where I basically screenshot or jot down these sections of these books so I can then talk about them and perhaps provide rewrites to use that as an opportunity to think about how to write books, just how to write prose in general, let's say. For this first video, I'm technically not doing it of a book that I have read, but I'm going to do it about a quote that often gets passed around. This quote is often used to emphasize or characterize Brandon Sanderson's style of writing. His writing is ostensibly simple, it's very straightforward. He wants it to be invisible, let's say. His prose is supposed to be like glass, you just see right through it. And this is in contrast to stained glass, where, provides all the pretty colors and all the flourishing and blah blah blah. Now, that is an interesting debate in and of itself, but I don't think that's actually going to be the focus of this video. So let's get into it. First, let's start with the quote. It's just one sentence. Quote, "The enemy had a lot of archers." And that's the one sentence, right? Now, let's start with my commentary. I guess the first point is that one quote is genuinely just one sentence. Like, obviously, there's a larger context, but the point is, this quote that gets passed around doesn't provide that context. So technically, I think the quote, maybe it's not the best in isolation, but usually I think you should provide the surrounding context in order to truly judge it, to see if it's worth tweaking or not. And that's actually relevant to the discussion I had on the Discord server about this specific quote. And we will discuss the actual context where it comes from, but I'm going to leave that for later in this video, because something that was talked about in this Discord server was, I guess, two basic questions. First off, with no surrounding context, how would you write this passage? And so I provided my own rewrite, and I'm going to read it here, and hopefully I'll be able to discuss why I think my quote is better than his. And not to, show off or fillet myself, or however you want to put it. I want to have the discussion. And of course I will show off in the process, but this is just a good way to do it, right? Alright, so here is my rewrite. Quote, "His traumatized eyes swept over the expanse, their man spilling out over the hills for seeming miles. The peak of each hill held a veritable army on its own. Gods, are those all archers?" Unquote. Okay, so obviously my quote assumes that this this Sanderson quote was just a description of the army, which is probably the worst interpretation, but again, we'll get to that later. Basically, the entire point of my approach, though, is that I don't really know how to tweak his quote or his sentence in general without completely ripping it apart and starting from the ground up. So, again, let's go back to the original. The enemy had a lot of archers. How would you tweak that? Right? If you're just trying to describe the quantity of archers, you're just saying, oh, how would you tweak it? Oh, well, the enemy had many archers. There were so many archers. There's a lot of different tweaks, but then you can ask, well, what exactly makes it better, right? And then you can maybe use contrived metaphors like, the enemy archers swarmed like a plague, or swarmed like a beehive. And, those just seem kind of lame to me. A little bit contrived, let's say. And perhaps you think mine is contrived, but I think it's more contrived in the context of a single sentence. If you're trying to paint a landscape, I think my sentence actually gets multiple sentences. But my approach, I think it does a better job for the purpose it's trying to serve, right? It has this creative flourish to it. So yes, I admit that I'm not the invisible prose writer, right? My sentences are not necessarily invisible, but it allows me to have a bit of fun as I'm describing things, right? Instead of just saying, oh yeah, there's a lot of archers, I'm actually communicating, I'm showing. So this leads to, I guess, the central point, which is showing versus telling. He is simply telling you that there's a lot of archers, and I am trying to, again, paint the picture that is showing. In fact, my quote essentially does everything to avoid simply stating it, even with metaphors, right? I'm not stating it outright. I'm kind of painting a picture without actually saying it in the basic description itself. I communicate that, yes, these are archers. And often this is a trick I like to do where I communicate it via internal monologue. Basically, I have like a rhetorical question asked to kind of cap off a description of something. But yes, since I was not aware of the actual context in which that Sanderson quote comes from, I said the following in the Discord is, to be fair to Sanderson, we don't know the context of the statement. So how would you salvage the sentence? So that was the second thought experiment I came up with, which was keep that sentence, but rewrite the context in which it's been placed to see if you can, as I said, salvage it. So instead of just rewriting it from the ground up or tweaking it here and there, keep it exactly the same, but just rewrite everything around it. Alright, so here is my rewrite. Quote, she ducked low, flinching from his impending form. But something was off. He was flinching in his own right, practically rattling, and she saw a scattering of barbs pouring down onto him from the sky. An arrow slammed down just before, and she stepped back, letting the man fall over her. A brick wall of darkness struck the air from her. The enemy had a lot of archers. Too many, it turned out. Unquote. Okay, so that was my, not necessarily rewrite, but my inclusion of that quote within a wider context that I think, quote-unquote, salvages it. So what was my general idea? The general idea was to communicate something that I think I hinted at before, which is that I think you can have simple, straightforward sentences that tell rather than show if it's put in a context where it warrants that bluntness, let's say. Telling and showing are something that should be balanced, right? It's not like you want to show literally everything. So I think if you can place it right, you can actually get away with it. It only looks bad if you strip it from the context in which it's been placed. So yes, if you take it out of context, then sure, it looks bad. But I think personally that my quote or the surrounding context in which I've placed his quote actually justifies its usage. Maybe I tweak some language here and there, but again, that kind of defeats the purpose of the thought experiment. So the general idea, yeah, she's in a one-on-one combat situation with, an enemy. And he seems about to kill her, he's standing over her. But then suddenly he gets hit by a swarm of arrows, and the only reason she survives is because he basically blocks all those arrows. And then the man falls over her, again further protecting her. And then it turns out this quote is essentially a kind of interior monologue, maybe not straightforward first person, but it's actually kind of tongue-in-cheek in that it's saying, it's potentially referencing something prior in the story where they've, freaked out about how many archers there are. And it's saying, I guess it was too many. Haha. So by presenting it in this way, I think it justifies the blunt, straightforward manner, perhaps the lack of creativity, the fact that it's simply telling rather than showing. Because it's not really the center, it's not even the focus of the description in question. Right? That's basically the only way in which you can justify these simple, straightforward sentences. I'm certain there are people that will disagree with that, because some people just like the simple language. But this is kind of the point of me creating these videos. If you happen to disagree, then expand on discussion. Now, on this Discord, I received some criticism or just commentary from Jason Furman. It's his Discord, so I will link his channel below, and you can find his Discord through his channel there. But let's move on to the actual content. So his commentary was basically, the description was redundant in places, and it also uses unnecessary words. So let me read his thing off, and then we can talk about my response, and then also, if you happen to be watching this video, provide your own commentary, because I thought this actually opened up different pathways that was fascinating in its own right. It's kind of like a diversion for the whole Sanderson thought experiment, but either way, I think it's all worth considering, including in a video, because it's just fascinating in its own right. Alright, so here's this quote. Quote, she ducked, flinching from his impending form, but something was off. He was flinching, practically rattling, a scattering of barbs pouring down onto him from the sky. An arrow speared the earth at her feet, and she stepped back, the man falling over her, striking the air from her lungs, a wall of darkness overtaking her. The enemy had a lot of archers. Too many, it turned out. Unquote. Okay, so that was a simple rewrite of what I said. He did change a few things, so that's what we're going to unpack here. So the first thing he mentioned is he didn't like the use of the word slammed for an arrow, because arrows don't slam. And I think, I understand the critique. Right, it kind of communicates the wrong picture in a way, because since when did arrows slam? Now that said, the idea I had in mind is to communicate the shock, right? It kind of it's like a boom, and it hits you. It's like, holy shit. So what I wrote was, I used the word slammed because I thought it helped capture the sudden shock it had on the narrator. Not literal, but I think it works. Basically, the descriptions are not objective in a straightforward manner, but I think they're kind of rooted in the perspective. So I'm kind of communicating how the narrator was feeling and reacting to it at the time within the word selection itself. Another critique was the usage of "in his own right" as part of my description. And, I definitely can see there that it's definitely more wordy. But that said, I think I prefer mine. I think it's worth including myself because I was actually referring to this repetition of the word flinching, right? So it starts with, she ducked low, flinching from his impending form. So I used the word flinching there. But then I used flinching again. He was flinching in his own right, practically rattling. That was my description, and he just cut out the "in his own right," basically. And yes, I understand. If you want to be more parsimonious with your words, then absolutely cut it out. The reason I used "in his own right" was to kind of distinguish, but also refer back to the prior usage of flinching, right? It's basically a way of saying, oh, but he's flinching too. But he was flinching in his own right. Another critique was "and she saw." Basically, the idea is that "and she saw" is redundant, right? Just describe what she saw. So, for example, my sentence was, "and she saw a scattering of barbs pouring down onto him from the sky." Well, just say, "a scattering of barbs pour down." So again, you just cut out the needless fluff. It's redundant, is the critique. And again, I perfectly understand where this is coming from. I think it's a fair critique to consider. Now, how would you justify it? Personally, I like sentences that have how do you put this, a more deliberate structure, a sentence that makes you stop, right? It reflects the beats of the events that are happening, that are being described. "And she saw" works for me because it implies another beat in the string of events. So she sees him rattling, and then she sees the arrows. One beat and then another. So back to the quote, "he was flinching in his own right, practically rattling, and she saw a scattering of barbs pouring down onto him from the sky." So the general idea is that she sees his reaction first, that's the first beat, and then it moves on, and she saw a scattering of barbs pouring down onto him from the sky. The sentence structure itself is kind of separating these two beats and making them explicit to kind of communicate how her attention, her realizations are separated and taking place one after the other. So, and then here's the sentence as he rewrote it. "He was flinching, practically rattling, a scattering of barbs pouring down onto him from the sky." Again, that's much sleeker, that's much more straightforward, so I perfectly understand it, and I don't think there's any way to resolve it. That said, his sentence is it's more like a pouring of information, right? I think the word he used on the Discord was that it's like a camera movement as it's like panning across. He agrees that the reaction comes first, and then it goes to the barbs pouring down. He just was visualizing it in a different way, I guess. If it's the camera panning across the different events, it's much smoother and more straightforward, right? So his sentence reflects that image. So I guess it comes down to how we're visualizing it, right? I was visualizing it as more like a sharper turn as one beat flows into the next, while he was thinking of it as a more fluid way of doing it. And then the last criticism, or the last change he provided, was basically his use of longer sentences at the end. So again, let's go back to my quote. "An arrow slammed down just before her, and she stepped back, letting the man fall over her. Period. A brick wall of darkness struck the air from her. Period. The enemy had a lot of archers. Too many, it turned out." Okay, so then his difference. "An arrow speared the earth at her feet, and she stepped back, the man falling over her, striking the air from her lungs, a wall of darkness overtaking her." Okay, so again, the difference is pretty straightforward. He just combined what I had separate sentences into just one sentence. At the end of the day, this, I think, is just preference. I didn't have all that much to say in response other than, yeah, I just prefer it because I think it's actually similar to what I was describing before about how I think it's just less information. It's when it's all combined into one sentence, it feels like an avalanche of information. I think this is why people tend to dislike long sentences because it just keeps on going and going, and there's no structure there to get you to stop, take in the information that's been communicated so far, and then continue so you can add on to it from there, rather than being swamped with all the information at once. That is a kind of discussion in its own right. Do you prefer shorter sentences rather than long ones? And personally, I actually use long sentences occasionally. I think they can be justified. Just it comes down to how they're structured and how liberally they're used. In other words, I don't like them used all of the time. So that was the short tangent that we went on, and I thought, again, these are worth considering. And also, if you happen to be watching this video and it interested you, what did you think? Did you have your own third perspective, or was there other ideas to communicate? All right, so to the last part, I'm finally going to provide the context to that one Sanderson quote. So again, the quote was, "The enemy had a lot of archers." Continuing, Khan's panic climbed to a peak as the first wave of arrows flew into the air. He stumbled again, itching to take out his shield. Badalit grabbed his arm and yanked him forward. Hundreds of arrows split the sky, dimming the sun. They arced and fell, dropping like sky eels upon their prey. Amaram's soldiers raised shields, but not Kaladin's squad. No shields for them. Unquote. Okay, so I'll stop reading for there, but on the screen you can see that it continues a little bit. But I think the general idea is being communicated. So when I first read this, I didn't think it was as bad, right? But obviously, upon reflection, we can talk about why it's not as bad. What exactly is it about this wider context that makes it more justified? And I think it goes back to my rewrite, which is that it takes it out of focus, right? This sentence is clearly not the focus of the scene. It's not the focus of the paragraph. It's basically something that fills out the description in a way. So in a sense, it does kind of justify it, right? Like it's not as standout ugly as before. Now that said, I think that actually leads to the real critique, which is, why does this quote exist at all? Ironically, even though it feels more justified in a similar way that I think it feels justified in my rewrite, where I try to place it in a better context to salvage it, that actually ultimately leads to it being completely unsalvageable. In other words, cut it. Right? It's so out of focus, it's so unimportant within the overall scene that's being described that it could honestly just be deleted. Just remove the quote entirely and read everything else. That's what it comes down to. I do think there's a level of maybe not malicious dishonesty on the part of people who keep passing this quote around. Like, obviously, it's an exaggerated example, and it's done in a tongue-in-cheek manner, but it's like they plucked out of either the worst possible quote you could find, and they're using it to characterize Sanderson's quote in general, and I don't think it's necessarily a fair critique. Everyone has a bad description. Everyone has a bit of redundancy. Maybe they could cut this quote here or cut it there. Cut Sanderson some slack. That's essentially the idea. Even though I'm criticizing him here and providing rewrites of what he was saying, maybe it's not that bad. I have now released both volumes of The Paths We Have Taken, which is the first arc in the Broken Reality. This is my grim, dark, epic horror fantasy series. It takes the political intrigue of A Song of Ice and Fire, the abrasive characterization of Abercrombie, the long-term storytelling of One Piece, and the philosophical horror of the Second Apocalypse to explore the human capacity for cruelty. Check it out if you are interested.